G'day, I'm Steve. Hey, welcome to the workshop. This is Woodworking Masterclass. And here's an excerpt from a live stream with Mike Davies, who I had in the workshop recently. He's from Record Power and also a master wood carver in his own right. And he's going to share how he sharpens chisels.
So how often do you sharpen your tools? And that was a question from Stephen. That really relates to the type of timber that you're using and when they need it. And to be honest, I think when we get into sharpening and talk about sharpening, it becomes, when you've worked with a really sharp tool, it becomes glaringly obvious when it needs to be resharpened, because a nice sharp tool should just glide through the timber. Everything becomes effortless. And so if I'm carving timber that is some Australian timbers have, I don't know whether is it silica? It feels like there's sand in it and grit, and it can be so harsh on your carving tools. But if your cuts have, see, all of these cuts, they've got a lovely polished finish to them. But if all of a sudden you start getting little white drag marks in the timber, the drag marks is simply showing that there's a defect in the edge of the tool. So if there's a little ding taken out the end of the tool, that's going to leave a mark in the resulting cut. And at that stage we'd get into just putting a nice new edge on your tool. Okay, so what is the perfect angle for a carving tool? It depends what you're working on. So the average angle of a carving tool, or actually a bench chisel, would be anywhere between 20 to 30 degrees. And I think the angle is determined by what you're doing with it. So if you're using a mallet and you're thrashing into a piece of oak, or what's a really hard Australian timber? Spotted gum. Then you probably want to go for a steeper angle, maybe 30 degrees, because obviously the keener the angle, the more easily it will be damaged. If, on the other hand, you're just doing delicate work, you're doing lettering or some precise work in a relatively soft timber, well, you might go for a 20-degree angle. And whichever angle you go for, there's a couple of important points that we have to remember. On a high-speed grinder, you must constantly dip the steel into water. So you've got to constantly keep it cool, because as you get close to that fine edge, as the edge of your bevel gets close to this cutting edge, it can get hot really, really quickly. And if you burn it, it goes back to its primary state. You take that tempering quality out of it. You've just heated it to cherry red again, and now it's gone hard and brittle. So with a high-speed grinder, after each pass, dip the tool into water to keep the blade cool. With a whetstone sharpening system, of course, you don't have to worry about that, because you've got water constantly being carried to the steel as it's being sharpened. But of course, that's a process all in itself, and we won't get into that now. But once you've got your ground bevel, the idea is that you get a nice consistent bevel, a nice consistent angle, and that the goal is we always want to keep those tips nice and intact. For a shaped tool, we can see that this is slightly tapered. Have an imaginary line running through the centre of the tool, and we're going to grind it at 90 degrees to that centre line. So at 90 degrees to the centre line, and keep the tips intact. Same for your bench tool, for your chisel. Generally you want that 90 degrees, and that could vary between 20 to 30 degrees, right? So once that's ground, and you've done that on your high-speed grinder or your whetstone sharpener, then it comes to the honing process. Now on a high-speed grinder, we have no choice but to go to bench stones. And again, there's lots of different types. Can you think of some other? I've got ceramic, diamond cutting systems, aluminium oxide, silicon carborundum. You know, there's a whole host of different ones you can get. A little bit of oil onto the surface. The oil doesn't act as a lubricant, it acts as a carrier. So what we're doing is it carries the loose particles of stone and metal away. It's not a lubricant. And at this point, we would feel the angle of the bevel. And now, what do you think about micro bevels? What do you think about secondary bevels versus...
On whetstone system, I don't use a secondary bevel. I have to have a primary.
Yep.
On a stone system, I have a secondary.
Yep.
Because I can go back to the stone and get working again very, very quickly, but that means then I'll have to take a fair bit of time off to get the primary back later on.
Yes. So, the idea about a secondary bevel or a micro bevel is that it's ground and you get a nice consistent grind at whatever angle you want. But when you come to hone, you just increase that ever so slightly. And what that means is that you know that as you're honing, you put in a bevel, a secondary bevel, right on the cutting edge where you need it. And you'll form a slight little burr inside, which we'll remove with slipstones. The beauty of a whetstone sharpening system is, as Steve says, you don't need to do that because you've got that much accuracy that you can hone right on the same angle as your ground edge. But when we're using stones, it's common to do a second bevel. The downside of that, though, is that each time you go, you're going to put a greater angle on your bevel, and so slowly you start to round it over, and you've got to go and regrind the tool again. So obviously it's preferable to, if you've got a whetstone sharpening system, to just use keep the same angle. I've got two different stones, so this is for gouges. I've got a stone that is clearly hollowed from years and years of sharpening gouges, and I've got a nice flat stone that I use for flat tools. For the gouges, the stone is horizontal in front of me. And we were talking about stance and positioning of shoulders and knees and so on, and now in this case I'd try and lock my elbow into my side. I'd feel the bevel where the bevel is, raise it ever so slightly, and then I'm going to, using my knees and body, so my arm actually stays in a fixed position, I would slide the tool and rotate it down the stone. And I can hear it cutting. I would actually only need to make 2 passes. So now what's happened is when I run my finger down the inside of the canal of the tool, we'll call it canal, I can feel a little burr has formed. So then that's where we have slip stones, which are shaped little stones. So you can get all different shapes and sizes. Now these are made of Arkansas stone. It's a finer grit than this bench stone. I would choose to keep the stone against the inside, flat on the inside of the canal, and then I'm just going to move it up and down. So can you just see this little film of oil now coming across on the surface? It just tells me that I'm actually making contact on that cutting edge. Can you see that oil just coming over the surface? So that's just removing that burr. And if I clean that off with a rag, you can see now, can you see that little micro bevel that I've put? There you go, there, look at that. You can see the bevel that I've put, the secondary bevel on the outside of the tool. Can you see that from the stone? And I've chosen not to put an internal bevel on the inside. Now, it is totally acceptable and common to use that finer slipstone to put a finer bevel on the inside. Now, can we see some oil coming on the inside of the gouge? So that tells me that I'm actually making contact with that bevel, and because this stone is finer, I'm putting a fine bevel on there and again on the inside.
And you're moving the stone, not the chisel.
Yeah.
Because you change the angle every time you move the chisel, is that right?
Yeah, I guess so. Do you know, I hadn't really even thought about that, but I think you're probably right.
That's what I was told. If you tried doing it moving the tool...
Yeah, cool. Yeah, you couldn't do it like that. Yeah. No, I see what you're saying there. Yeah, so we're moving the stone and keeping the tool in a nice locked position. So this fine Arkansas stone is just honing the edge of that tool. And next step would be a strop, and a leather strop. So I'm going to slide it down. As I'm sliding, I'm rotating that bevel all at the same time. You got that? And that just puts a beautiful polished finish on. So the true test of how sharp that is when we carve into a piece of timber. And what we're looking for is a really polished cut. If you've got a slight little indentation, a slight little imperfection in the blade, you'll see it as a white drag mark through the timber. And so that means you've either got to go back to your slipstones, or you might just be able to take it out on the strop. And so I hope that explains the sharpening of a gouge. So flat chisels, same principle applies, anywhere between 20 and 30 degrees. With a whetstone sharpening system, we don't have to put a secondary bevel on, because a whetstone system will give you that much accuracy that you don't need to do that. But if you are going to put a secondary bevel on, now the stone is running away from me, and I'm supporting it in between my thumb and finger, and I'm just feeling the bevel, and I just raise it ever so slightly, and generally I will just take a figure of 8 across the stone. Oh, beautiful. So already I've got a burr which is formed on the back of that blade. It's a nice consistent burr, so I know that I've covered the entire length of the blade. I can feel it. And so now it would be a matter of placing that nice and flat on the back. Now we're keeping it seriously flat. There's no movement, but all I'm doing is just helping to remove that wire burr.